The clock on the wall of Lou's diner read 3:22 in the morning. 3:22. The kind of hour when the world held its breath, when the living and the dead seemed to occupy the same space, when nothing made sense anymore. Outside, a blizzard had swallowed Las Vegas whole. Snow fell in sheets so thick that the windows had become solid white walls. The roads vanished. The sky vanished. There was only the diner, the neon glow bleeding red and blue across the checkered floor, and silence so complete it felt like a living thing pressing down on everything. Alejandro Calabrese stood in the center of that silence, and he was trembling. Tall, broad-shouldered, his charcoal suit tailored to perfection, his dark hair swept back from a face carved from marble, his storm-gray eyes burning with an intensity that had made grown men weep, Alejandro Calabrese did not tremble. Not in 15 years. Not ever. But he trembled now as he knelt beside the small figure collapsed on the black and white checkered floor. Emma. His daughter. 6 years old, her small body crumpled like discarded paper, blood matting her blonde hair, her lips turning blue in the cold air that seeped through the diner's walls. "Open your eyes," he whispered. His voice, usually deep and solid like an oath carved in stone, fractured like thin ice under weight. "Emma, open your eyes for me. Please." Behind him, his two oldest lieutenants stood frozen. Vinny, dark-haired and scarred from his right eye down to his jaw, his hand gripping a pistol. Nino, built like a concrete wall, his suit worth more than a decade of honest work, his face completely blank because blank was safer than showing what he felt. Their guns were drawn. Their hands were steady. Their eyes were utterly helpless. She was not responding. The child was not responding. The diner door swung open with such violence that it banged against the wall. Wind screamed through the frame, snow swirling in like a ghost, like a curse, like death itself walking through the doorway. But it was not death. It was a waitress in a black and white uniform, her apron soaked with coffee stains and worse things, her dark hair pulled back in a bun so tight it looked like it caused her pain. She was 27 years old but looked decades older. Her eyes were brown, almost black, and they held a knowledge of suffering that made her ageless. She had a small scar on her left cheekbone, thin as a blade. Her name was Aria Morgan, and she was absolutely nobody. She saw the child. She saw Alejandro's hand shaking uselessly. She did not hesitate. Aria dropped to her knees beside Emma like she was falling into prayer, and she moved with a precision that spoke of training, of practice, of hard-won knowledge about what to do when death arrived in small packages. Her hands, calloused from 10 years of washing dishes and scrubbing tables, positioned themselves on Emma's chest. She tilted the child's head back. Checked the airway. Began compressions with desperate certainty, pushing down, releasing, pushing down again. Her count was whispered, steady, a rhythm like a heartbeat trying to restart a heart. "Come on, baby. Come on." 1 breath. 2. She sealed her mouth over Emma's lips and breathed life into lungs that had forgotten how to work. The wind howled outside like a thing in agony. The neon lights flickered, casting red shadows across Aria's face, across Alejandro's face, across the small body of a child caught between worlds. Emma coughed. Her body convulsed. Her eyes fluttered. She gasped, and the sound was the most beautiful thing Alejandro had ever heard in his entire life. He had heard symphony orchestras. He had heard his mother sing when he was too young to remember her face. He had heard children laugh. But he had never heard anything like that gasp, like a soul returning from the brink, like a prayer being answered in the most broken, desperate way. Aria kept her hands on Emma, kept her eyes on the child's face. Her fingers were shaking now. Everything was shaking. The diner seemed to shake, or maybe that was just the storm outside, the world splitting apart at its seams. Alejandro's eyes snapped to the waitress. To this invisible woman in the cheap uniform. To this nobody who had just pulled his daughter back from death's door. He had never seen her before in his life. But what Aria did not know, what she could not have known as she knelt there on that checkered floor, as her own heart raced fast enough to break, was that this moment would shatter everything. It would shatter the walls between poverty and power. It would shatter the carefully constructed lies she had been telling herself. And most importantly, the secret she had been hiding for 6 months, the secret that was worth $35,000 and her own life, was about to destroy them both. The sound of sirens screamed across the frozen city. Before we continue, drop a like if this story hits you. Share it with someone who needs to hear it and subscribe so you do not miss what's coming tomorrow. Now let us go back to the beginning, to the moment 3 days before this frozen night, when Aria Morgan's world did not just collapse, it shattered. The time was 10:47 on a Monday morning. The diner was empty except for the hum of the espresso machine and the smell of grease burned into the walls since the Nixon administration. Aria sat in the back office, a cramped space no larger than a closet, with a letter in her hands that had the weight of a sentence. The letter was stamped in red ink across the front. Final notice. Those 2 words stacked on top of each other like a death sentence, like a curse that could not be erased, like the lid of a coffin being sealed. Her hands trembled as she read the numbers again, even though she had memorized them yesterday, and the day before, and every day for the past 48 days. $35,000. Due in 72 hours. Or the debt collector named Douglas Hale would take everything. She already had taken everything else. Aria opened her small purse with her fingers moving like they belonged to someone else, someone's ghost wearing her skin. She pulled out her wallet. The leather was cracked and faded from so many years of use that it had started to crack into pieces. She counted the money inside it slowly, as if the number might change if she counted carefully enough. $34. $34 and a final notice. The discrepancy between those 2 numbers was so vast, so mathematically impossible, that it seemed to open up a hole in the universe. How was a person supposed to cross that gap? The gap was not $2,000. It was not $5,000. It was $34,966, and Aria Morgan was a waitress in a diner who earned $4.25 per hour plus tips, and the tips had been getting worse because the customers had been getting meaner, and everyone could smell desperation the way they could smell mold in an old apartment. She put the bills back in her wallet. She put her wallet back in her purse. The office around her seemed to shrink, the walls pressing inward, the air growing thin. 3 days. 72 hours. 4,320 minutes. And none of them would save her. The back door of the diner swung open. Marcus, the owner, stood in the doorway. He was 54 years old, with grey streaking through his black hair, and he wore the perpetual expression of a man who had made 1,000 small compromises and was now living in the accumulated weight of them. "You need to come out front," he said. His voice was flat. "There's a man asking for you specifically. And Aria, I'm going to be honest with you because I think you need to hear it from someone who gives a damn. He looks like the kind of man who does not ask twice." Aria's blood turned to ice. She stood up slowly, pressing the letter into the pocket of her apron where it sat like a stone against her ribs. She walked past Marcus into the diner. The place was still mostly empty. The lunch rush had not started yet. At a booth in the corner, sitting with his legs stretched out like he owned the space, was Douglas Hale. He was 63 years old, with thinning grey hair combed over a scarred scalp. He wore a suit that had cost $3,000 once but had gone soft and wrinkled from years of use. There was a gold ring on his left hand, ugly and thick, the kind of ring a man wears to remind himself that he has hurt enough people to earn jewelry. He was smiling at her. The smile was like a blade wrapped in ice. "Aria," he said. His voice was soft, reasonable, the voice of a man discussing the weather. "Come sit with me." She Saturday. She had learned a long time ago that there was no point in refusing Douglas Hale. "How are you?" he asked. "You look tired." "I am fine," she said. Her voice sounded like it was coming from very far away. "You do not look fine. You look like a woman who has not slept in days. Which makes sense, because you owe me $35,000 and you have 72 hours to produce it." He leaned forward. His eyes were the color of winter, pale blue and empty of anything that resembled mercy. Now, we have talked about this before. Many times. You understood the terms when you borrowed the money. You understood that if you did not pay on time, the consequences would be severe. I know, Aria whispered. Do you? Because I am going to be very specific about what happens next. If you do not have the money by Thursday at 6 p.m., I am going to come to your apartment. And I am going to take everything that is worth anything. Your television. Your computer. Your kitchen table. And then I am going to hurt you in ways that will make you wish you had never borrowed money from me in the first place. He said it the way another man might discuss the recipe for soup. Like it was information. Like it was inevitable as gravity. Please, Aria said. Please, I need more time. I am working double shifts. I am saving every penny. You have nothing to save, Douglas said. I have been watching you, Aria. I know what you earn. I know what you spend. And I know that you will never, ever earn $35,000 as a waitress. Which means you need to make a choice. He pulled a business card from his jacket pocket and slid it across the table. The card was blank except for a phone number. This is a woman named Evelyn Blackwell. She is a very wealthy woman who employs people like you in various capacities. The work is discreet. The pay is excellent. 1 week, she says, and you could have enough to pay me back. Maybe even enough to disappear. Aria stared at the card. She did not touch it. What kind of work? She asked, though she already knew. She already knew because she had heard the rumors, the whispers among the other waitresses about girls who took cards like this, about girls who disappeared into the wealthy parts of the city and came back different, or did not come back at all. The kind that a woman in your situation should be grateful to get, Douglas said. He stood up. He was taller than she expected, taller than he should have been. Thursday at 6 p.m., Aria. With the money or with the consequences? Your choice. He walked out of the diner. The door closed behind him with a small bell's chime, the most peaceful sound in the world against the most impossible choice of her life. Aria sat in the booth with the blank business card in her hand, and the card felt like it was burning her skin. Through the diner window, she could see him get into a black SUV. The engine started. The vehicle pulled into traffic like a predator sliding back into water. She had 72 hours. She had $34. She had no way to survive this. And 3 blocks away, in a penthouse office that overlooked the Las Vegas Strip like a man overseeing his conquered kingdom, Alejandro Calabrese was about to learn that his daughter had gone missing. 72 hours. That was all Aria Morgan had left. She stood in her studio apartment on the 3rd floor of a building that smelled like boiled cabbage and broken dreams, staring at the letter in her trembling hands. The paper was official, cream-colored, embossed with a logo that meant nothing except finality. Final notice, stamped in red ink so bright it looked like blood. The debt collector had written the amount in a box at the bottom, and the number seemed to grow larger every time she looked at it. $35,000. Due in 72 hours to Douglas Hale or face consequences that the letter did not bother to specify because everyone understood what those consequences meant in a city like Las Vegas. Aria opened her small wooden box on the nightstand. Inside lay $43 in crumpled bills and a handful of coins that would not add up to a single additional dollar. She removed the bills and counted them 3 times because the number was impossible, because it could not possibly be this small, but it was. $34. That was all. $34 between her and complete destruction. The apartment was silent except for the sound of wind pressing against the single window. Outside, clouds were gathering. Black clouds, heavy with snow that had no business existing in Las Vegas but came anyway, as if nature itself wanted to remind everyone how little mercy existed in this world. Aria moved to the closet and looked at the black and white uniform hanging on a wire hanger. The fabric was so thin from repeated washing that light passed through it in places. The white apron was stained permanently with coffee and grease that no amount of bleach could remove. The collar was frayed. The hem was coming loose on the left side. She had owned this uniform for 3 years. It was the only job she had ever kept because no other place would hire a woman who looked the way she looked, who had the scars she carried, who had nowhere else to go. She had to work tonight. The graveyard shift at Lou's Diner started at 10 p.m. She always worked graveyard because fewer people came in, and fewer people meant fewer opportunities to disappoint someone, to move too slowly, to be in the way. Aria pulled the uniform from the hanger and held it against her body. In the mirror, she could see her own face, and it shocked her every time. The exhaustion made her look older than 26. The fear made her look hollow. The bruises on her throat, hidden beneath her collar, made her feel like someone who was already half gone, already disappearing. 2 weeks earlier, she had borrowed money. Not much. Just enough to escape. She had been living with a man named Marcus who drank whiskey and used his fists the way other men used words. One night, after he broke her wrist and she could no longer grip a coffee pot, she had borrowed $5,000 from a man named Douglas Hale, who stood on the corner of Fremont Street wearing expensive sunglasses and a smile that contained no kindness whatsoever. He had given her the money without asking questions. He had also given her his card and told her she would owe him $12,000 back within 30 days. 30 days had passed. She had managed to scrape together enough to give him half. She had sold her grandmother's watch. She had skipped meals. She had taken extra shifts, worked through sickness, ignored pain in her wrists and shoulders and back. But there was no way to make that kind of money working overnight at a diner where customers left no tips and the manager shouted at her for existing. When the first letter arrived, she understood. When the second letter arrived, she began to pray, though she had not prayed since childhood and did not believe God listened to people like her. When the third letter arrived, stamped final notice, she understood that prayer had never worked for her and never would. The memory of his face appeared in her mind without warning, as memories of violence always do. Douglas Hale was a thin man, sharp-featured, with eyes that looked at people the way a vulture looks at dying things. He had stopped her 3 days ago as she was leaving the diner, had pushed her into the alley behind the building where the dumpsters overflowed with spoiled food and the walls were painted with graffiti nobody bothered to hide anymore. His hand had closed around her throat. Not gentle. Not threatening. Simply doing it, the way you might pick up a cup of coffee. His fingers pressed against her windpipe, and she could not breathe, could not speak, could only feel the world narrowing into the crushing pressure of his grip. $35,000, Aria, he had said, his voice calm, almost conversational. 3 weeks from today. You bring me that money, or I bring you to my associate. Evelyn Blackwell. You ever heard of her? Aria had shaken her head as much as his grip would allow. She employs women like you. Pretty women. Young women. Women nobody is looking for. You understand what I am telling you. She had understood. Everyone in Las Vegas understood. There were stories about women who took jobs from Evelyn Blackwell, stories whispered in diner booths and in the break room when the manager was not listening. Stories about girls who disappeared into luxury apartments and penthouses and private clubs and did not come back the same. Some of them did not come back at all. He had released her, and she had gasped for air, her throat burning, her lungs screaming. He had straightened his jacket and walked away as if he had done nothing at all, as if he had not just changed her entire future with his hands. Now, standing in her apartment with the uniform against her chest and the letter on her bed and $34 in her hand, she understood that there was no escape from this. There was only the uniform, only the diner, only the graveyard shift that paid minimum wage and the knowledge that no amount of work could save her. The wind outside grew stronger. It rattled the window frame. The building creaked and settled, and Aria thought about the stories mothers told their children, stories about people who persevered, who worked hard, who believed in themselves and found their way out. Those stories were lies. Those stories were written by people who had never stood in a studio apartment counting $34 while a red-stamped letter sat on their bed like a death sentence. She put on the uniform. The fabric was cold and smelled like industrial detergent. She tied the apron around her waist. She looked at herself in the mirror one more time and tried to find something in her reflection that was strong, something that was fighting, something that was not already broken beyond repair. She could not find it. The diner was 3 blocks away. The walk always took 10 minutes, past boarded-up storefronts and closed businesses and homeless people who had already given up trying to be invisible. By the time Aria arrived at Lou's diner, the snow had begun to fall. It came down in thick flakes that melted when they touched the ground, and the sky was the color of old concrete. Lou's diner was a relic. The neon sign in the window flickered and buzzed, casting the letters in sickly pink and blue. The building was narrow, pressed between a pawn shop and an abandoned nightclub. The checkered floor inside was worn through in high-traffic areas. The booths had tape holding the vinyl together. The counter had a long crack running through the laminate that looked like a lightning bolt. It was 10:30 p.m. when Aria clocked in. The diner was empty except for an old man sitting alone in a booth, nursing coffee he had probably been drinking for 3 hours without ordering anything else. The manager, a woman named Betty who had forgotten how to be kind sometime in the previous decade, looked up from her phone and said, "Bus tables, wipe down the soda machine, clean the bathrooms, and do not waste time." "Yes," Aria said. "Yes, what?" Betty snapped. "Yes, Aria moved through the diner like a ghost. The old man did not look at her. She gathered his empty cup and returned to the kitchen where 2 cooks stood in front of the grill, smoking cigarettes and talking about something that happened at a bar somewhere. They did not acknowledge her either. She was invisible. This was what she had become. This was what the world had made her into. The clock on the wall showed 10:33 p.m. She would work until 6 a.m. That was 7 hours and 13 minutes of existing in this space, of being invisible, of not earning enough money to matter. After that, she would have 75 hours left until the deadline. Then nothing. At 11:15 p.m., the door chimed. A woman entered. She was in her 60s, with grey hair pulled back severely and a coat that cost more money than Aria had earned in 6 months. The woman looked around the diner as if she had wandered into a place where she did not belong and was trying to find the exit. But then she saw Aria. And her face changed. It became sad. It became knowing. And she walked directly to Aria and said, "You are the girl Douglas Hale is blackmailing, aren't you?" Aria felt her heart stop. She could not speak. She could not move. She could only stare at this woman and understand that somehow, impossibly, her life was about to become even more dangerous than it already was. The clock on the diner wall read 3:22 in the morning when everything changed. Lou's diner sat empty, the vinyl booths vacant, the coffee station humming its lonely mechanical song. Outside, the November blizzard had swallowed the city whole. Snow piled 3 feet high against the windows. Wind screamed like something wounded, rattling the glass so hard Aria flinched with every gust. The roads had vanished beneath white. Nothing moved on the streets except the storm itself, wild and absolute. Aria stood behind the counter, wiping down the espresso machine with a rag that had seen better years. Her shift had 7 hours left. She was counting them like a prisoner counts days. Her hands were raw from the bleach, her feet ached in her worn black flats, and in her pocket sat exactly $34. $34 to her name. The final notice from Douglas Hale's people sat on her kitchen table at home, stamped in red ink that looked like blood. Final notice. 3 days. $35,000 or disappear. The bell above the door chimed. Aria did not look up at first. The bell chimed constantly, even when the door swung open from the wind. But then she heard something else. A gasp. A child's gasp, sharp and broken. She lifted her head. The door hung open to the frozen night, snow pouring inward like the diner was breathing it in. And there in the threshold stood a small figure, maybe 6 years old, wearing a pink jacket torn at the seams. Blood ran down the left side of her face. Her lips were blue. Her eyes were wide and searching, scanning the empty diner with the desperation of someone looking for salvation. Then the child's eyes found Aria. "Aria," the girl whispered. Her teeth chattered so violently the word came out fractured. "Aria, I remembered you." Aria's rag fell from her hand. She knew this child. She knew this small face, these eyes that had learned to be afraid too young. Emma. The girl from the shelter 6 months ago, the one Aria had held through nightmares, the one she had failed to save when Hale's network came and tore them apart. Aria ran. She crossed the diner in 4 strides, her sneakers slapping against the checkered floor, and caught Emma as the child's legs gave out. The girl was shaking like a leaf in a hurricane, her small body vibrating with cold and terror. Aria lifted her, carried her away from the open door and the screaming wind, and set her down in the nearest booth. "Emma, baby, look at me," Aria said, her voice trembling like a candle in the wind. "Look at me. You are safe now." But Emma was not looking at her. Emma was staring past her, at nothing, her eyes glassy and unfocused. The blood on her temple was still flowing. Aria grabbed napkins from the metal dispenser and pressed them to the wound, gentle, careful. Emma flinched but did not pull away. Aria's mind was racing, cataloguing injuries like a nurse, though she was no nurse. Head wound, bleeding. Hypothermia, the skin so cold it felt like touching ice. Torn jacket. One shoe missing. "Who did this to you?" Aria whispered. "Where did you come from?" "Emma, baby, where is your mother?" The girl's lips moved. No sound came out at first. Then, barely audible, trembling through her frozen teeth, the bad woman. "She took me again. I got away. I ran and ran and ran." Aria's hand stilled. "What bad woman?" Emma's eyes finally focused on hers. "Papa's friend. She said Papa did not want me anymore. She said I was broken. She was mean, Aria. She was so mean." Every instinct screamed at Aria to call an ambulance. But she knew better than that. Ambulances meant paperwork, meant authorities, meant questions about where this child had been and why. It meant social services and investigations that would take time they did not have. Emma's next words changed everything. "Papa is Alejandro Calabrese." I remembered the name from before. I said it to the police lady at the station. I said, "My papa is Alejandro." And the bad woman got very scared. She locked me in the room, but the window was open and I climbed out and I ran in the snow and I remembered this place because you took me here once for pie, Aria. You said this place had the best pie in the world. Aria felt her blood turn to ice in her veins. Alejandro Calabrese. The name everyone in Las Vegas whispered like a prayer to a dark god. The Mafia boss. The man whose empire controlled everything from the casinos to the streets to the very air people breathed. The man whose face appeared in newspapers only when someone was dead. She had seen his picture once, maybe 2 years ago, in a property dispute that made the news. Tall. Dark. Eyes like a storm about to break. And terrifying in a way that made her understand why people moved out of his path. This child belonged to Alejandro Calabrese. Which meant saving her meant stepping directly into the path of the most dangerous man in Nevada. It meant bringing down every consequence he could unleash. It meant that Douglas Hale, the human trafficker who owned her debt and whose deadlines were closing in like a fist, would become irrelevant compared to what might happen next. But Emma was shaking. Emma was bleeding. Emma was 6 years old and had crawled out a window into a blizzard because someone had called her broken. Aria wrapped the child in every tablecloth in the booth, pulling them from the stack behind the counter, bundling her like a cocoon. She pressed fresh napkins to the wound. She found a bottle of water in the back and helped Emma drink, slow sips, careful. "I need to call someone," Aria said. "Do you remember the phone number? Can you tell me your papa's number?" Emma nodded. Her small voice rattled off 10 digits. Aria found the phone in her pocket, the phone she had turned off because Douglas Hale's calls had become threats, and she could not bear to hear them anymore. She turned it on. Her hands were shaking. She dialed. A man answered on the first ring. Not Alejandro. Someone else. Someone whose voice was careful and controlled. Mr. Calabrese's line, the man said. I have his daughter, Aria said. Emma. She is at Lou's Diner on 5th and Elm. She is hurt. She is bleeding. You need to send someone now. Silence on the other end. Then, who is this? Someone who found her. Please. Hurry. The line went dead. Aria held Emma close. The wind continued to scream outside. The clock on the wall ticked forward, 1 second at a time, and Aria waited in that diner with her arms around a child that did not belong to her, understanding with absolute clarity that everything was about to change. 20 minutes later, headlights cut through the blizzard. 3 black SUVs pulled up outside Lou's Diner, moving through the impossible snow with the certainty of vehicles that did not accept the word no. Their engines cut off. Doors opened. Men in dark suits emerged, moving with the synchronized precision of people trained to move together, to anticipate, to respond. And then he stepped out. Alejandro Calabrese moved through the snow like a man walking through nothing at all. He was tall, 6'2" or 3", broad through the shoulders in a coat that cost more than Aria had earned in a year. His hair was dark and slightly disheveled, as if he had run his hands through it repeatedly. But it was his face that stopped time. It was sharp, angular, beautiful in the way that blades are beautiful. A scar ran from just below his left eye to his cheekbone, thin and white against olive skin. And his eyes, they were the color of a storm about to break, and right now they were wild. Frantic. Desperate in a way that did not match the power radiating from every line of his body. He did not walk into the diner. He strode. His eye scanned the space in a quarter second and found Emma on the booth bench. What happened next was something Aria never forgot. The most powerful man in Nevada, a man who controlled hundreds of people and millions of dollars and the infrastructure of organized crime across an entire state, dropped to his knees beside a 6-year-old child and began to shake. Emma, he whispered. Her name broke in his throat like it was made of glass. Emma, my God, Emma. His hands hovered over her, not quite touching, as if he was afraid she was made of something breakable. Emma's eyes went wide. She looked at him for a long moment, and then she reached out and wrapped her small arms around his neck. Alejandro pulled her close, and his whole body seized. He buried his face in her hair, and his shoulders shook in a way that was almost silent, almost invisible, but absolutely devastating to witness. The men behind him, Vinny and Nino and the others, stood motionless. They exchanged glances that said they had never seen this before. In 15 years of working for Alejandro Calabrese, they had never seen him like this. They had never seen him on his knees. They had never seen him shake. Then his head lifted. His storm-gray eyes found Aria. She tried to step back, to make herself invisible again, but there was nowhere to go. The back of the diner was empty. She was trapped between him and the counter, and his gaze locked onto her with the weight of something physical. You called me, he said. His voice was rough, fractured. Yes, Aria whispered. You saved her. It was not a question. I found her at the door. She was alone. She was hurt. Alejandro stared at her for a moment that felt like an eternity. Then he turned back to Emma, checking the wound on her head with gentle fingers, his expression shifting into something controlled and dangerous. Get Dr. Russo, he said to Nino, his voice now steady as stone. My house. Medical room. Now. Nino was already moving. And find out where she was taken from, Alejandro continued, his tone dropping into something that made every person in the diner understand that someone was going to pay for this. I want names, locations, everything. And I want to know who the woman was that took her. He looked back at Aria. You come with us. It was not a request. The drive to his house happened in silence except for the sound of the SUV cutting through the snow and Emma's small, steady breathing. Aria sat in the back with the child, and Emma's head rested against her shoulder. Alejandro sat in front, phone in hand, issuing orders in a voice that was quiet but contained within it the weight of absolute command. They arrived at his mansion just as dawn began to break, pale grey light seeping across the frozen landscape. The house was enormous, all stone and glass and contemporary lines, positioned on a hill overlooking the city. Security gates. Floodlights. The kind of home that announced itself as belonging to someone important and dangerous. Dr. Russo was waiting. A small man in his 60s with grey hair and steady hands, he moved Emma to a medical room on the ground floor and began his examination while Alindro stood in the doorway, rigid and unmoving. The doctor worked in silence, cleaning the wound, running a light across Emma's pupils, asking gentle questions about pain and memory. Hairline skull fracture. Moderate contusion. Hypothermia beginning to reverse in the warmth. No internal bleeding. No permanent damage. She will be fine, Dr. Russo said, and Alindro exhaled like he had been holding his breath since the moment he arrived at the diner. Emma slept, finally, her small body relaxed in the medical bed, one hand reaching out toward the space where Aria stood. Alindro did not leave her side. Hours passed. The sun climbed higher. The blizzard outside began to ease, the wind dropping to a whimper. It was mid-morning when Alindro finally stepped into the hallway, closing the door softly behind him. Aria was sitting on a bench against the wall, exhausted, her uniform still damp from the diner, her hand still wrapped around a cup of cold coffee that someone had brought her an hour ago. Alindro looked at her. Really looked at her. And then he sat down beside her, close enough that she could smell expensive cologne and something darker underneath, gun oil, maybe, or the metallic scent of danger. "You knew her name before I said it," he said quietly. "How do you know my daughter?" And Aria told him everything. The marble bathroom was silent except for the sound of rain hammering the windows, mixing with the snow that still clung to the glass like frozen tears. Aria sat on the cold tile floor, her back pressed against the wall, staring at her reflection in the mirror above the sink. One eye was swollen completely shut, a deep purple blooming across her eyelid like a terrible flower. Her throat was a landscape of bruises, each one shaped like a finger, each one a promise of what would come next if she failed. Blood crusted on her split lip. Her hands would not stop shaking. She had escaped the alley behind the mansion gates only because Vinny and Nino had appeared with guns drawn, had carried her back inside while Douglas Hale screamed threats that followed her like a curse she could not outrun. 3 days. He had given her 3 days, and now those days had passed like water through her fingers. She had $34 left. That was all. $34 and a body that was worth nothing to anyone except the men who owned the debt stamped across her chest in red ink. The rain intensified outside. Thunder rolled across the city like a warning. She thought about running. Not tomorrow, not next week. Now. She could slip out of this mansion the same way she had slipped through most of her life, invisible and silent, leaving no trace except the exhaustion in her bones. She could disappear into the storm and let Douglas Hale's network swallow her whole. At least then, Emma would be safe. At least then, Alindro would not have to choose between protecting a daughter he had just recovered and protecting a woman who was nobody, just like Evelyn had said. Trash. Debris. A mistake. She stood on legs that trembled like a newborn fawn learning to walk. The tile was so cold it burned against her skin. She gripped the edge of the sink, studying her ruined face, and something broke inside her chest. Not her body this time. Something deeper. Something that had been holding on by a thread so thin it was almost invisible. Then she heard it through the closed door. "Where is Aria?" "I want Aria." Emma's small voice, confused and frightened, calling from somewhere down the hallway. For years old, maybe 5, still learning the shape of the world, still believing that people who cared about you stayed. Still believing in the impossible. Aria sank back down to the cold tile, her legs folding beneath her like a puppet with its strings cut. Tears mixed with blood on her face, and she understood with a clarity that cut like a blade through everything else, she could not leave this child again. She could not run. She could not disappear. Emma had already lost too much, already learned too young that the people who loved you could be torn away in an instant. If Aria vanished now, it would teach her that truth all over again. The bathroom door opened without a knock. Alejandro Calabrese stepped inside, and the world seemed to shrink around him. He was still wearing the clothes from the diner, his white shirt rumpled, the top 3 buttons undone, his expensive leather coat draped over his arm like he had meant to take it off hours ago and forgotten. His dark eyes moved across her face, and she saw something break in his expression. Not pity. Something harder than pity. Fury. The kind of rage that had no sound because it was too large, too consuming to fit inside a single word. He knelt beside her on the cold tile, his designer suit creasing at the knees, and his hands moved across her face with an impossible gentleness. His fingers traced the swelling around her eye, the bruises on her throat, the split in her lip, cataloguing every injury like he was reading a story written in blood. Who is he? His voice was quiet, and that made it worse. Quiet voices were the most dangerous. Aria told him everything. Douglas Hale. The debt that had started small and grown like a cancer. $35,000 by the end of 3 days, or worse would come. She told him about the trafficking network, the women who disappeared into it like water going down a drain, the way her body had become a map of what happened when you could not pay. She told him about the final notice stamped in red ink, about the $34 in her pocket that had never been enough and never would be. And the woman. Alejandro's voice turned to ice. Evelyn Blackwell. You know her. Aria shook her head, confused. She had seen Evelyn at the shelter 6 months ago, elegant in her designer clothes, speaking about redemption and second chances while actually choosing which desperate women to feed into Hale's network like meat into a grinder. My investigators found the connection last night, Alejandro said, and his jaw tightened until the muscle beneath his skin worked like something alive. She has been working with Hale for 2 years. Every woman who disappeared from her charity organizations, she took a cut of the profit. She helped orchestrate Emma's second kidnapping. She builds empires on the ruin of other women's desperation. He stood, pulling his phone from his pocket with a movement that was sharp and final. Bring them both in, he said into the phone. Now. I do not care if you have to tear the city apart. Now. He hung up without waiting for a response. At dawn, 12 men in black tactical gear moved through the streets like ghosts, like a shadow with teeth. The warehouse where Douglas Hale ran his operation was on the edge of the industrial district, a concrete building with no windows and a rusted door that had never been locked because Hale believed himself untouchable. He was wrong. The door exploded inward. Flashlights cut through the darkness like blades. 37 women were found in holding cells, some of them barely conscious, all of them bearing the marks of ownership that Hale carved into his property. Files were seized. Records were photographed. Bank accounts were frozen before Hale could move his money to another name. He tried to run. Of course he did. He made it as far as the back office, a room with no windows and no exits except the one he came through. When the tactical team cornered him, Douglas Hale collapsed to his knees, and he was trembling like a cornered animal, like something small and pathetic that had been pretending to be dangerous. He was 52 years old, his hair gray at the temples, his expensive suit soaked through with sweat, his eyes wild with the knowledge that his world was ending in real time. Please, he begged, his voice cracking like old leather. Please, Calabrese, I did not know she was yours. Alejandro did not go himself. He stayed in the mansion with Aria and Emma, stayed while Dr. Russo finished his examination and confirmed once more that the child would be fine. But his voice over the phone was final, stripped of everything except purpose. Not death, he said quietly. Death would be too quick. Too easy. Too merciful. Hand him to the Corsetti family. They have been looking for the man who took their daughters for 5 years. They will appreciate the gift. Douglas Hale was dragged from the warehouse screaming, his voice echoing across the empty industrial district like an animal being slaughtered. He disappeared into the night, handed off to people who understood patience and pain in ways that made death look like kindness. The police found no body. There was no body to find. But while Hale was being broken into pieces by men who had been waiting for him in the dark, Evelyn Blackwell was being arrested in her penthouse, and her downfall was something entirely different. The FBI arrived at dawn with federal warrants and cameras flashing like lightning. Evelyn was still in her silk robe when they came through the door, her face pale, her elegant composure shattering like glass as agents in blue jackets moved through her apartment with the efficiency of people who had done this 100 times before. The evidence was overwhelming. Bank transfers, emails, client lists, photographs of women she had selected, marked, and delivered like packages to a man she knew was a monster. Within 1 hour, every news outlet in Las Vegas had the story. Within 3 hours, every major network in the country was running her mugshot, her arrest, the revelation that a beloved philanthropist had been selling vulnerable women into bondage while accepting awards for her charity work. Within 1 day, her foundation was shut down. Her assets were seized. Her bank accounts were frozen. Her name became synonymous with betrayal, with cruelty disguised as compassion, with the particular evil of someone who destroys from a position of trust. She was arraigned 3 days later. 40 years in federal prison for conspiracy and human trafficking. Her lawyers claimed mitigating circumstances. Her lawyers claimed she was a victim of Hale's manipulation. No one listened. The court of public opinion had already sentenced her to something worse than imprisonment, irrelevance, disgrace, the knowledge that her name would be remembered only as a cautionary tale about what happens when elegance hides evil. Both of them destroyed. Both of them erased from the world not by death but by something slower, something that picked apart everything they had built and showed it to be rotten at the foundation. Alejandro did not celebrate. He simply returned to the medical room where Emma slept, sat beside her small body, and watched her breathe. 1 year had passed. The kind of year that rewrites a life so completely that the old version seems like a story someone else lived. Aria Morgan stood at the floor-to-ceiling window of a downtown Las Vegas penthouse, 43 stories above the city, wearing a black dress that fit her like it was made for her, because it was. The woman staring back at her reflection was unrecognizable from the one who had poured stale coffee at 3 in the morning with bruises blooming like dark flowers along her collarbone. Her hair fell in waves past her shoulders, glossy and intentional. Her eyes held something they had never held before. Power. Not the kind that came from money or men, but the kind that came from surviving hell and building something beautiful on the other side. The nonprofit occupied 3 floors of a building downtown now. Aria's House of Hope. 22 women currently in residence. 11 had already transitioned to jobs, apartments, new lives scraped together from the wreckage of the old ones. She had hired a case manager, a trauma counselor, a legal aid attorney. She had funding from private donors, grants from foundations, and Alejandro's silent financial backing that she pretended not to know about, though she knew everything. Emma was 7 now. 7 and thriving in a way that seemed impossible for a child who had been bleeding in a diner at 3:22 in the morning. She attended the Meadows School, wore uniforms with her name embroidered in navy thread, came home with gold stars on her homework and stories tumbling out of her mouth like she had never learned to stop talking. Aria picked her up every Friday from school. They went for ice cream. They went to the movies. Emma called her Aria, not Mama, not yet, but something had shifted in the way she said that one word, like it meant more than a name. Alejandro had not called in 3 months. The thought arrived the way difficult thoughts always did, with the weight of a stone dropped into still water. After the raid. After watching Douglas Hale collapse in sobs as federal agents placed handcuffs on his wrists, after seeing Evelyn Blackwell's face drain of color as her empire crumbled in real time, Alejandro had simply disappeared into his world. The one she did not belong to. The one made of dangerous men and darker choices and the kind of power that consumed everything it touched. She had told herself she understood. Crisis created connection, and when the crisis ended, so did everything else. She had told herself this was mercy. Better to cut ties cleanly than watch him slowly realize what everyone already knew, that she was still nobody, still a waitress at heart, still someone with $34 and a foreclosure notice that had changed everything. The balcony door was open behind her, carrying the smell of desert rain from a storm that had swept through the city 3 hours earlier. The air was cool, almost cold, and it carried the faint mineral scent of rain on hot asphalt, the smell of the city washing itself clean. Below, Las Vegas sparkled and glittered, millions of lights reflected in the dark windows of buildings, in the windshields of cars moving like small bright beetles through the streets. She heard footsteps. Not the sound of housekeeping or the assistant who sometimes came by in the evenings. These were deliberate footsteps, the kind that belonged to someone who knew where they were going, someone who had the right to be there. Alejandro Calabrese stood in her penthouse doorway. He was smaller than she remembered. Not in stature, he was still 6'3", shoulders like an athlete, the kind of physical presence that made other men unconsciously move out of the way. Smaller in the way that certain things become smaller when you see them again after believing you never would. He wore a charcoal suit, a white shirt unbuttoned at the throat, and in his right hand he held something that caught the light from the city below. A key. Her key. The one she had left at his mansion a year ago, on the night everything had changed. His face was unguarded in a way she had never seen it. Not the controlled expression of the Mafia boss, not the fierce protectiveness he had worn like armor when Emma was in danger. This was something rawer. Something that looked like he had not slept properly in weeks. How did you get past security? Her voice sounded strange in her own ears. Smaller. Younger. Afraid. I own the building. He stepped inside and closed the door behind him, the sound of the latch catching loud in the silence. I have owned it for 6 months. I waited, thinking you might figure it out. Thinking you might come to me. But you did not. And I have been too much of a coward to come to you until tonight. She did not move from the window. The city lights reflected in the glass behind her, and for a moment she could see 2 versions of herself, one there, one here, doubled like a ghost. Coward is not a word I would use for you. It is the word I would use. He moved toward her, and the sound of his footsteps on the marble floor was the only sound in the room. I have been carrying something for a year, Aria. A truth I was too afraid to speak. Her heart was pounding so hard she thought he must be able to hear it. She turned to face him fully, and he was close enough now that she could see the fine lines around his eyes, the faint silver threading through his dark hair at the temples, the scar that ran from his eye to his cheekbone like a blade had once tried to cut him in half and had almost succeeded. When I saw you save Emma in that diner, he said, and his voice was different now, lower, rougher, like someone had scraped it raw. When you protected her with nothing to gain, with everything to lose, you cracked open something inside me that had been sealed since my brother's betrayal. I did not believe in trust anymore. I did not believe in goodness. Then you showed me both. You showed me that the most invisible person in a room could be the strongest. Aria's eyes were burning. She could feel tears gathering, pressing against her eyelids, threatening to spill down her cheeks. She had promised herself she would not cry in front of him again. She had promised herself a lot of things that seemed to evaporate the moment he walked through that door. I pulled away because I was terrified, Alejandro continued. Terrified that if I let myself love you, I would bring my world down on your head. The men I have made enemies of. The things I have done. The blood that stains everything I touch. I thought staying away was protecting you. I thought removing myself from your life was an act of mercy. It was not mercy. Her voice broke on the word. It was abandonment. He reached for her then, his hand moving to cup her face, his thumb brushing away a tear that had escaped. His touch was gentle in a way that seemed impossible coming from someone so dangerous. I know. I know it was. And there is no excuse for it. But I am here now, and I am asking you to let me stay. Not as the man who rescued you. Not as the Mafia boss with money and power. As the man who has loved you since that night, who has thought of you every single day, who wakes up in the dark knowing that he made the worst mistake of his life when he let you walk away. Emma asks about you. The words came out before she could stop them. Every Friday when I pick her up from school, she asks if you will be there. I tell her you are busy. I tell her you have important things to do. I do not tell her that I spend my evenings on this balcony looking out at the city wondering if you are somewhere out there, alive, breathing, moving through your dark world without me. I am not asking you to be invisible anymore, he said, and his eyes were holding hers so intensely that it felt like falling. I am not asking you to hide or to apologize for existing or to make yourself small so that I can pretend I do not love you. I am asking you to stand beside me, seen, equal, mine. I am asking you to be the woman who saved my daughter and saved me, out loud, in front of everyone. She stepped into his arms on the balcony, the city lights reflecting in both their eyes, and when he kissed her it was like the past year had not happened, like there had never been any space between them at all. The kiss was desperate, hungry, full of longing that had been waiting to be released. His hands moved to her waist, pulling her closer, and she could feel his heartbeat against her chest, strong and real and alive. When they finally pulled apart, she was crying openly now, tears streaming down her face, and he was wiping them away with his thumbs, murmuring things in Italian that she did not understand but felt anyway, felt in her bones, felt like coming home. 6 months later, Aria and Alejandro stood together in a ballroom on the 15th floor of the Venetian, a charity gala for Aria's House of Hope. She wore a red gown that fit her like water, and his arm was around her waist, possessive and certain. The room was full of people who wanted to talk to them, to congratulate them, to celebrate the 217 women who had passed through Aria's program, the lives rebuilt, the futures salvaged from the wreckage. Emma was there, running between the tables, healthy and whole, laughing at something Vinny had said. Vinny and Nino stood nearby, still dressed in their black suits, but they were smiling, genuinely smiling, in a way that suggested something fundamental had shifted in Alejandro's world. The empire was legitimizing. The foundation had his name on it now, along with Aria's, and every dollar that came in went toward rescuing women from the same networks that had trapped Aria, had held her with debt and threats and the knowledge that no one would come. Aria had visited the women at her shelter that afternoon. She had sat with a 23-year-old named Jasmine who had been trafficked for 18 months, who had just arrived 3 days ago with nothing but the clothes on her back and a collection of scars that mapped a terrible geography. She had taken Jasmine's hands and said, "You are going to be okay. You are going to rebuild. It will take time, and it will be hard, but you will not be invisible anymore." The moment was small, almost private, one woman telling another that survival was possible. But it was the moment that mattered most, the moment that proved that sometimes miracles are not given, they are fought for, earned through blood and courage and the refusal to disappear. When Alejandro pulled back to look at her in the ballroom, his eyes were full of something that made her understand, finally, that she was not the only one who had been saved. He had been drowning in a world of control and darkness, and she had thrown him a rope woven from nothing but her own fierce unwillingness to accept that anyone deserved to be invisible or unloved or alone. 3 months later, Aria and Alejandro stood together on the balcony of the penthouse, the same balcony where he had confessed his love, where everything had shifted like tectonic plates moving beneath the surface of the earth. Emma was between them, now 8 years old, wearing a pale pink dress, her dark eyes wide as she looked up at the sunrise breaking over Las Vegas. The storm had passed. The sky was clearing. The sun touched the horizon and painted everything gold, the buildings, the streets, the water in the fountain below, even the faces of the 3 people standing together, no longer separated, no longer broken. "After the rain, the sky clears," Aria whispered. And sometimes miracles come from the most unexpected places. If this story moved you, drop a like right now. Share it with someone who needs to believe in second chances. Subscribe because tomorrow we have another story that will break you open and put you back together. Comment below, what would you have done in Aria's position? I read every single one. We wish all of you watching this video good health, a joyful life, and days filled with peace and happiness. Thank you for staying with us until the very end. Goodbye, and we will see you again in the next video.